This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On October the 24th, at our annual Halloween special event, Derwin Mak spoke on the Salem Witch Trials of 1692.
Thank you, Pat. Can you hear me? All right, great. So, Salem Witch Trials, you've all heard of it. You may have seen Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible. But let's look at the history behind the Salem Witch Trials and what was going on in Salem, Massachusetts around that time. So, first, Salem was founded in 1626 by Roger Conant, a Puritan pioneer. Now, when you visit Salem, you see the statue in the town, and a lot of visitors look at the statue and think that's a witch because of the pointed hat. But no, that's not a witch, that's Roger Conant, the founder of the town. And the name Salem is derived from that Hebrew word shalom, or peace, although as you'll notice, it wasn't always a peaceful town. Now, Salem back in the 1690s had two areas. There was Salem Town, which is the seaport, and it was, today we can call it Salem, Massachusetts, and Salem Village, which was where the farms were. It was the more suburban part of the area, and now it's called Danvers, Massachusetts. So, the history of Salem begins with the Puritans. Now, the Puritans were a religious denomination that arose during the Reformation in England, and by the 1600s, it had come into conflict with the Stuart monarchs, especially James I and Charles I, and the Church of England over religious and political differences. And from 1620 to 1640, 16,000 Puritans left England in what they called the Great Migration and went over to the American colonies and the West Indies to get away from the Stuart monarchs and the Church of England, which they didn't succeed in reforming the Church of England to the way they wanted. Right? Now, this picture shows a group of Puritans landing at a place that they would later call Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. And this particular group would later become known as the Mayflower Pilgrims, although interesting enough, nobody called them the Mayflower Pilgrims until the 1790s, when the Americans were trying to invent a national mythology for themselves. But there they are, and they landed in Plymouth Rock at 1620. And their neighbors there were the Wampanoag natives, right? And here's a picture of a Massaswat chief of the Wampanoag smoking the ceremonial peace pipe with Governor John Carter. Right? So things were peaceful at first. And these Puritans at Plymouth Rock held what the Americans now call the first Thanksgiving in 1621, which is this famous dinner where they had a good harvest and they invited their Wampanoag neighbors for dinner. Now, in actuality, there had already been previous Thanksgiving dinners in the Americas. People in Virginia had been having Thanksgiving dinners since 1607 at least, and the Native Americans had their own Thanksgiving ceremonies and festivals as well. But this is the particular dinner that would become heavily mythologized in American history and culture as being the first Thanksgiving, and it's the basis of their holiday in November. Well, there was Thanksgiving and peace, but then it didn't take long before war broke out in the colony. By 1637, a mere 17 years after the Mayflower Pilgrims had landed, war broke out between the English settlers and the Pequot tribe. Right. And then war broke out later on between the tribe they were allegedly at peace with, the Wampanoag. In 1662, Major Josiah Winslow led a military expedition that arrested and killed Wamsutta, chief of the Wampanoag. And he was the son of Massaswat, the chief who had signed the peace treaty with them. So relations with the Native Americans were deteriorating very quickly. And relations got even worse in 1675, when war broke out with Metacom, chief of the Wampanoag, also known as King Philip. This war is called King Philip's War, one of the more devastating wars in colonial history. Okay. Meanwhile, back in England, In 1660, Oliver Cromwell's regime collapsed upon the death of Cromwell, and King Charles II came back as a restored king. So the Puritans and Cromwell were out of power in Parliament, and now England and Scotland and Ireland were back under the control of the Stuarts and the Church of England. Right? This didn't sit well with a lot of Puritans. And of course, there was stress in the colony because the Stuart monarchs wanted more control over the American colonies. Now, the American colonies, several of them, were governed by chartered companies, not by the crown. And this is, so for example, Massachusetts Bay was governed by the Massachusetts Bay Company. There was actually a company set up to go and colonize these areas. Now, this is not an unusual situation with early English or British colonization. Parts of Canada, you may remember, were ruled by the Hudson Bay Company before they came under Crown control. And the British East India Company ruled parts of India as well before they came under Crown control. So the Stuarts, under particularly James II of England or James VII of Scotland, wanted more control over their American colonies, so King James II revoked the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter in 1684. Now this left the colony without a legal form of government for a while. But then 2 years later, he united all the New England colonies into one government called the Dominion of New England, which lasted about 3 years. So now New England was under control of the crown as opposed to a chartered company. But the colonists resented this. They thought this was the government infringing upon their freedom. So you can see that as early as the 1600s, these American colonists were already developing a sense of identity of being independent and separate from England. Right. Well, James II himself was overthrown in 1688 by William of Orange and Queen Mary in the Glorious Revolution, right, which brought, the House of Orange to power in England and Scotland. And here's that famous painting in the House of Parliament showing the members of the House of Lords and the members of the House of Commons offering the throne to William and Mary. Well, they, of course, went to undo some of the things that their predecessor had done, so they dissolved the Dominion of New England in 1689, which left Massachusetts without a legal form of government again. Now, to add to the political woes of Massachusetts, there was a separation crisis going on in Salem Village. The farmers who lived in Salem Village didn't get along well with the merchants in Salem town, so they wanted to separate and form another town. But meanwhile, the merchants who lived in Salem town, they liked dealing with their colleagues, and so they favored remaining part of Salem town. Now, Salem Village had a minister named Reverend Samuel Parris, and he supported separation. And there's Reverend Parris. But in retaliation, the merchants refused to contribute to his salary. So there was a lot of rivalry in the area between people who favored separation, people who favored keeping a united town, between merchants and farmers, and between Reverend Parris and his opponents. Well, while all of this was going on, and with the threat of natives attacking, the devil came to Salem in January 1692. So here's an 18th century chapbook illustration showing the devil giving dolls to witches, right? So how did the devil come to Salem? Well, it began in the house of Reverend Parris, the Reverend, right? Two girls living in his house, 11-year-old Abigail Williams and 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris, his daughter, suddenly started acting weird and yelling and screaming and rolling on the floor and claiming that they had seen the devil. Okay, now, as I mentioned, Elizabeth was the Reverend's daughter, and Abigail Williams was his ward. Now, this, of course, was very, very concerning to a clergyman, that two girls in his household had seen the devil, right? And upon questioning, they accused 3 people of casting spells and bewitching them. Tituba, who was Paris's slave, and she may have been either African or a West Indian Carib native. Sarah Osborne, a beggar, and Sarah Good, an argumentative woman who hadn't gone to church for a year. So the girls accused 3 of the more, how should I put it, unpopular or least powerful people in the village of being witches, right? Now, this spread because not only did the 2 girls in Reverend Paris's house claim they had seen the devil, but other girls they knew claimed to have seen the devil. Eventually, 11 young girls claimed they had seen the devil and started acting weird. Well, under questioning, Tituba confessed to witchcraft, right? And she actually implicated her other 2 co-accused. She said she saw the devil with Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. And she claimed to have made a witch cake, a so-called witch cake, which she fed to a dog to make the dog go away. And of course, back then, dogs were sometimes accused of being familiars or animal spirits who followed witches around. Okay. So here's yet another early American illustration of Tituba acting witchy. Well, as often happens in witchcraft situations, the people who get accused of witchcraft start accusing other people of witchcraft to try to, lessen the blame. They can always claim, oh, so-and-so bewitched me, or so-and-so led me down this satanic path. And then what happens is those people accuse other people of practicing witchcraft or trying to bewitch them. So from June to September 1692, local authorities arrested between 100 to 200 people on suspicion of witchcraft. Now, here's the interesting thing. This witch hunt was actually an anachronism by that time. Witch hunting had largely ended in the British Isles in the 1660 with the end of the Cromwell regime. There had been previous periods of witch hunting in England and Scotland before, especially under King James VI of Scotland, or the first of England, because he was obsessed with witches. He actually thought witches tried to ruin his wedding, right? And there had been another period of intense witch hunting under Oliver Cromwell, because Cromwell, as a very religious Puritan, was always on the lookout for anti-Christian enemies, right? But with the restoration of the Stuarts under Charles II, religious piety was no longer a national concern. Indeed, Charles II was probably by Puritan standards very much a libertine. In fact, possibly the most popular woman in society wasn't the Queen, it was actually his mistress, Nell Gwyn, right? So, and also Europe was entering the period of the Enlightenment, when the Europeans were starting to rid themselves of old superstitions. And it was becoming increasingly rare to find anyone in Europe who actually believed that witches exist. Nonetheless, a witch hunt was brewing in one of the American colonies while Europe had stopped believing in witches. Meanwhile, back in London, the Crown, William and Mary, and the English government were designing a new government for Massachusetts, right? And they created the Royal Charter for the province of Massachusetts Bay. And this would be a charter that would give Massachusetts Bay self-governing powers, right? So it would still be a colony of the Crown, but the American settlers would get some self-government. Try to please everybody, right? And this was a rather large colony. It includes Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Plymouth Bay Colony, the province of Maine, what we now know as the state of Maine, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, the English-ruled part of Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. So it was a very large colony. And William and Mary appointed Sir William Phipps to be the new governor. Now, Sir William Phipps was not an English aristocrat that they were going to send overseas. He was actually a Massachusetts boy of humble origins that rose up through society. He started out as a shepherd in Massachusetts, as a shipwright, and he founded a company that went around looking for sunken and wrecked Spanish ships and would salvage the gold from them. And he took the goat to England and became a celebrity there because he was spending the money, and it also helped that he gave some of the goat to government officials, right? And he became a sort of celebrity in London. So when it came time to appoint a governor, William and Mary thought, well, let's appoint William Phipps and send him back to Massachusetts. So he went back. So he started going back to Massachusetts in 1692. Now here's the interesting part: as the English were designing this new government for Massachusetts and appointing their governor, nobody in England knew this witch hunt was going on. Okay. So when Governor Phipps returned to Massachusetts, he was surprised and horrified to find the colony in a state of witch hysteria. People were running around accusing each other of witchcraft, right? So he had to do something about this. So he established something called the Court of Oyez and Termine, right? And the words mean to hear and determine. And I think in some American courts you can still hear the bailiff shout "Oyez, oyez, oyez," right at the start of proceedings, right? Now, this was a court established by Governor Phipps, and it has the distinction of being one of the first courts, and some historians say possibly the first court, founded by self-governing Americans, as opposed to a court that the English had created back in London and given to them, right? And this court was established to try the accused witches. Now, by today's standards, it would not seem to be a very fair legal system. The judges were also the prosecutors, and the accused did not have any right to legal counsel. They had to defend themselves, right? And as you shall see, the forms of evidence that were admitted or would probably be rejected today, right? But here was a court that he established. Now there's a picture here of Mary Welcott, one of the accused witches, and one of the afflicted girls rolling around on the floor. So they did put some witches, accused witches, on trial, and on June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop was convicted of witchcraft and executed. Right, so she's the first one. Now we'll hear more about Bridget Bishop later on. And then more trials took place, and the witch hunters searched for more evidence. Now, this picture is a scene typical of what happened in England and Scotland in the 1640s and 1650s, and happened again in Salem. The witch hunters would strip the clothes off the accused witch and look for, certain weird birthmarks or mows that they would consider to be signs of Satan, right? Now, as in Salem, as in England and Scotland, for some reason, every adult male found a reason to skip work and leave the fields just to go watch the witch finders examine the accused witch. Right? Now, during the trial, the afflicted girls are brought in as witnesses. So what type of evidence did they give? Well, as they'd done before, they screamed and yelled and moved their arms, legs, and heads, and claimed that the accused were torturing them from a distance. Then at the trial of Martha Corey, they moved their hands and feet in the same way that Martha Corey did during the trial to show that she was psychically controlling their bodies. And they also would point up at the roof, at the ceiling, and claim to see brightly colored birds that nobody else in the room could see. And of course, all of them claimed to have seen the devil. By the way, that's not actually a photograph from the 17th century. Photography hadn't been invented yet. That's from a movie called The Witch. Okay. Now, one of the more controversial aspects of the trials was the use of spectral evidence. And spectral evidence is where the accusers claimed that the accused witch had appeared in the witness's dreams and hallucinations. And this was evidence that the witch was trying to control the mind of her victim, right? And spectral evidence was both encouraged and discouraged by a person named Cotton Mather. Now, Cotton Mather was another local reverend, and he's an interesting character too. Now, he was obsessed with witches, and before the witch trials, he had written a book about demonic possession of some children in Boston, okay? Now, he was Now, before the trials began, he had been a proponent of spectral evidence, saying, yes, it should be admissible in court. But then when the Salem Witch Trials broke out, he claimed that, no, we must be cautious about using spectral evidence. But this doesn't mean that he's the saint. He was a saint of the Salem Witch Trials. If anything, he was a devil. He was not a judge at the trials, but he did encourage a lot of accusers and judges to convict the accused witches. Right? He also had a rivalry going on with another Puritan Reverend, George Burroughs, and he urged people to accuse George Burroughs of witchcraft, urged the judges to try him and convict him, and actually got his fellow Reverend executed. Right? So he's not a saintly character at all. Interestingly enough, after the trials, he changed his mind and said spectral evidence had been a good thing to allow in court. Now, here's one of the ironies of the Salem Witch Trials. Confession was actually your best defense. None of the persons who confessed to witchcraft were executed. That's because they had a value to the judges. They could keep these persons and use them to find other witches. But all of the 19 persons who got executed had refused to confess, and all of them had pleaded not guilty. So you were statistically better off if you just confessed to witchcraft right away. And there's Rebecca Nurse, one of the accused. Now, the end of the trials. There were so many people accusing each other of witchcraft that the accusation spread to Boston. And in the autumn of 1692, someone accused Governor Phipps's wife of witchcraft. Well, at that point, he thought he should end the trials. So he established a new court called the Superior Court of Judicature, which role was to end the trials. And then he pardoned but did not release all the remaining prisoners in May 1693. And then 10 years later, the General Court of Massachusetts declared the trials to be unlawful. And this is one of the great tragedies of the Salem Witch Trials. One of the first courts established by self-governing American colonists, its major achievement was to commit this mistrial of justice, right? Which is a sad way to begin any legal system. Well, here's the aftermath. 100 to 200 people were imprisoned, 19 people were hanged, and one person was crushed to death under rocks. That was Giles Corey. He refused to enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty, and so the judges put him on the ground and piled up rocks on top of him for 2 days until he died. You might wonder, why would he undergo such a torture? Well, because if he had been tried and convicted of witchcraft, the court would have the right to confiscate his property. But by dying with neither a trial nor a conviction nor a confession, that way he guaranteed that his family would inherit his farm and property. Right? Okay. 4 to 13 people died in prison. 2 dogs were executed as accomplices to the witches, right? And many people remained in prison for their inability to pay prison fees. When you got put in prison in Massachusetts back then, it was not free. You had to pay for your food and your rent, so to speak. And those who were too poor to pay for that went into debt, and they just stayed in prison indefinitely, even after the governor had pardoned them. Okay? Reverend Paris, in whose household this fiasco had started, and who had encouraged the girls and the accusers, was voted out of office as minister and left town. Salem Village was so embarrassed by this incident that it separated from Salem town and renamed itself Danvers in 1752. Although today the people of Danvers wish they had stayed as part of Salem because there's so much tourism revenue to be had. Okay, so here are the list of the people executed or crushed to death by decision of the court. As you can see, women outnumber men more than 2 to 1. 13 women were hanged, 6 men were executed, including Reverend George Burroughs, a clergyman, and 1 man, Giles Corey, was crushed to death under rocks without either a trial or a conviction. Now, not much is known about what happened to the afflicted girls after the trials, but we do know that Elizabeth Parris got married in 1710 and had 4 children, and died in 1760. Anne Putnam was the only one of the girls to actually recant and for her role in the trials. She actually confessed that she had falsely accused persons of witchcraft, but still claimed that she had been deluded by the devil. So she wasn't going to take 100% of the blame, right? She died and married in 1715. Now, if you've ever read the script for Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, he mentions in there that Abigail Williams became a prostitute in Boston, but there's no historical evidence for that. Arthur Miller invented that rumor just for his play. Okay, Cotton Mather, he was unrepentant to the end. In 1692, he wrote a book called The Wonders of the Invisible World, where he justified the trials, but it was filled with personal attacks and insults on the accused, right? To the very end, he refused to repent for his role in the trials, but this made him an outcast in Boston society. People would just spit at him on the street in Boston, and he was a pariah there until he died in 1728. Now, here's the interesting question we may never know the answer. What caused the witch hysteria? There have been various theories as to how the witch hysteria came about. One was that it could have been the mischief of bored Puritan girls, right? The other one was there may have been some sort of mass hysteria in society and people were just paranoid and began looking for witches. Another popular theory was that it was a way to settle land disputes between several rival families. And indeed, there was a lot of rivalry between different families and political figures in Salem at that time. Or it could have been a way to eliminate political rivals, because you saw 2 prominent Puritan clergymen, Parris and Burroughs, fighting against each other, with one eventually surviving and the other one getting executed, right? But one of the more interesting theories that has come about in the 20th century is that there was a hallucinatory ergot fungus in the wheat, right? In the 20th century, people discovered that there's a certain fungus called ergot that sometimes grows in wheat, and if you make bread that had this, with wheat that was infected with the fungus, some people get hallucinations after eating that bread. So it's quite possible that the afflicted girls may have eaten bread that was infected with this fungus. The trouble is we may never really know what caused the witch hysteria. Now, what's Salem's contribution to American culture and society? Well, if you've ever read the horror stories by the horror fiction writer H.P. Lovecraft, you may have heard of a town called Arkham. Now, Arkham doesn't really exist, but Lovecraft writes it up as being a small New England town where everybody knows each other, but everyone has a very dark past. Families there are descended from evil spirits and monsters and so on. Arkham is based on Salem. It's his way of using Salem in the 19th century and 20th century as a setting. There's also the play The Crucible, written by Arthur Miller in 1953. Now, on the surface, it's about the Salem Witch Trials, but he was actually using it as a metaphor for the Red Scare and the McCarthy hearings. Okay, so Salem today. For about 200 years, the people of Salem were actually quite embarrassed by the witch trials, but at the end of the 19th century, they start to milk the whole witch reputation for tourism, right? So today, if you go to Salem, you can buy an iron patch showing a witch, right? There's a Salem News, their local newspaper. It's got a witch logo on its box. Okay, that's the police department shoulder patch, with the witch on it. Okay, and TV Land, the rerun channel, erected a statue of Elizabeth Montgomery from Bewitched, right? Everyone remembers watching that above a certain age, right? Okay, right. Now it gets better. There's the U.S. Coast Guard patch in Salem, right? And there's actually a school in Salem called Witchcraft Heights Elementary School, okay? And if you know, Americans love their football. They go watch high school football every Friday, right? It's really, when high school football teams play, it's really big news over there, right? Well, their local team is called the Salem Witches. Okay, so everything there has a witch theme. Okay, all right. So so there's been witch tourism there since the 19th century, and this is the Salem Witch Museum. Now, Salem has about 7 or 8 museums, of which only 2 of them don't have the word witch in its name, right? The 2 are the Peabody Essex Museum, which is it's the only museum there that a real museum curator would consider a museum, right? And, it's like the equivalent to the Royal Ontario Museum, but for artifacts related to Massachusetts. And the other one is, I kid you not, the Salem Pirate Museum, a museum about people who would go, pirates who would raid other ships or around Massachusetts and New England. And now these witch museums tend to be kind of tacky or cheesy, as you will now see. Now, this is the center of town, so I scanned a map and put it there. And this center of town includes various places of historical interest, like the old burying point where famous people are buried, and a monument to the persons who got executed in the witch trials. Interestingly enough, the square that I show you there is actually quite small. You could fit it all into Nathan Phillips Square. So it doesn't take a lot of time to walk from one historical site of Salem to the other historical site. But when I was walking there during one summer, this young lady accosted me. Okay, and this happens every summer in Salem, right? So she told me her name was Bridget Bishop. I thought, wait a minute, that's the first person they executed, right? Yeah. And there's a play in Salem every summer called Cry Innocent, right? Now, historical records show that Bridget Bishop wore something called a red paragon bodice. So there's Bridget Bishop in her red bodice, right? Now, the historical Bridget Bishop was the owner of either a tavern, an apple cider house, or a house of ill repute in Salem Village. So, as you can see, not everybody in Salem at the time was a pious Puritan. Okay? But while I was talking to Bridget Bishop and I was trying to explain how cameras work to her, these 2 gentlemen accosted us, and they both warned me that I was talking to a witch. I said, oh dear, I'm talking to a witch. Could there be anything worse? And then these 2 ladies came up to us and asked me why I was talking to a witch, and said that Bridget Bishop was definitely someone I should not be talking to, which got Bridget Bishop upset. Well, they then surrounded her and hauled her away to a building, but invited anyone on the street to follow them. As I got to the doorway of the building, one of the young gentlemen told me that he was very happy to have me as a member of the court, but I need to pay a court fee to enter the courtroom. So I did not pay to be a member of his court, but I did go to another courthouse in the Witch Dungeon Museum. Now, this is yet another one of those tacky museums they have there. And they reenact the trial of Elizabeth Proctor in there. So there's the narrator of the trial, right? And there's Elizabeth Proctor, the accused witch. Now there's Mary Warren, one of the afflicted girls. And who kept on shouting throughout the trial that Elizabeth Proctor was a witch, that Proctor had tried to control her body and her mind, and Warren said she had seen the devil, right? And there's the frightened narrator and Mary Warren. Now look at the people behind Mary Warren, okay? Those aren't real people. Those are department store dummies dressed in 17th century clothes. So, I mean, could it get any tackier? Now, this trial is fantastic if there are young children in the audience, right? Because as Mary Warren was pointing to Elizabeth Proctor and shouting and screaming that she was a witch, and as Mary Warren was yelling that there was a yellow bird flying near the ceiling, a boy in the audience stood up, pointed at Mary Warren and said, "She's the witch." Well, after the trial, which ends in the not surprising conviction of Elizabeth Proctor, your Puritan guides would take you downstairs to where they recreate the dungeon. So this is a recreation of a single-person jail cell of the period. And they recreate the hangings with more department store dummies. Okay. And you can see another department store dummy as Giles Corey being crushed to death under the rocks. Okay. Yeah. All right, so back to more respectable places, the old burying point. So this is an old cemetery there. And if you look amongst the stones, you will find Judge John Hathorne's grave. Now, he was one of the judges of the trials, right? And if you're interested in this type of thing, here's a tombstone showing the winged skull. It's a skull with wings, and it's a motif that's very prominent throughout New England. And I've seen it a few times at Greyfriars Churchyard in Edinburgh, Scotland. I actually haven't spotted one in Canada yet. Not that I hang around graveyards a lot, but anyway. And near the burying point is the Witch Trials Memorial. So this is a stone wall that was erected as a memorial to the people who were executed at the trials, right? And there's a memorial stone engraved with the name of Rebecca Nurse, whose trial I witnessed, right? But look behind, okay, look in the background behind the memorial wall. You see that sort of pinkish colored brick building? That is the Salem Witch Village. Now, the advertising is somewhat misleading. If you pick up the brochure, you think it advertises itself to be about a museum about the Salem witches, but when I entered it, I found nothing about the Salem witches in there. But I saw a lot of exhibits about Wicca and demonstrations of Wiccan rites going on in there. And I thought, oh, this is peculiar, right? And you know, is it a Wiccan temple or a tourist trap, right? You know, like any other tourist trap, there's that cardboard thing where you stick your head in for the photos, right? Or is it both, right? Because the people inside didn't mention anything about Cotton Mather or Rebecca Nurse or Mary Warren or Governor Phipps. They were talking about, you know, the equinoxes and certain Wiccan festivals, right? And the exhibits in there have nothing to do with the witch trials. These are pre-Christian pagan characters, some of whom still exist in society today, like the jack-o'-lantern, right? And then I discovered that there were Wiccan shops in Salem as well, selling all this Wiccan stuff. Now, this struck me as being theologically confusing, because Wiccans will always claim that they are not devil worshippers. The devil or Satan is something that comes from Christianity or Judaism, depending on how you read the Old Testament, right? And that the devil and Satan represent evil under those religions, whereas Wicca is a pre-Christian pagan religion, and it's not evil, therefore they have nothing to do with Satan. Yet they've opened up these shops in the city in America that is most closely associated with the devil, right? The only thing I can think of is that they knew there would be a tourist market there, and so they came there to exploit the tourists. Okay. Now, there's a house there called the Witch House. That's a misnomer. It's actually the house of Judge Jonathan Corwin, one of the judges, so it's not really, a witch did not really live in there. Now, this is the oldest building left standing in Salem. It's the one building from the 1690s that is still there. So you can visit it. Now, the AT&T office at 10 Federal Street is also historically significant. That used to be the site of a prison where some of the accused had been imprisoned. Okay. Now let's go to Danvers, the other Salem, Salem Village. There's a historically significant site there too, the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, right, which is the house of Rebecca Nurse, one of the accused witches, well, executed witches. And there's a building on the homestead which is not so old. Well, there's Rebecca Nurse's house. Okay, this building is not very old. It only dates back to the 1980s. It was a replica of a meeting hall built for the PBS series Three Sovereigns for Sarah, which was about the witch trials, right? But after the movie company left, they just left the building behind, right? Which is good because it becomes an audio-visual center for tourists and visitors, right? So you go inside the meeting hall and you watch a little movie about the witch trials. And Danvers has its own witch trials memorial as well. It's this concrete, it's a stone edifice, right, upon which are engraved the names of the people who died during the trials. Now, not everything in Salem is related to witches, right? Believe it or not, there's other things happen in Salem. Salem Harbor is quite beautiful and attracts a lot of tourists. And a lot of people don't realize that Salem was actually one of the busiest seaports in New England. It did a lot of maritime trade. Almost all the goods that came from Asia, that is China and India, would pass through Salem before going to the other American colonies. Right? Indeed, in Asia, some people actually thought Salem was its own country because so many ships came from Salem. Right? But in the 19th century, the port began to silt, the harbor began to silt up, and the ships diverted away to New York and Boston, and those two cities took away a lot of the maritime trade from Salem. On the right, you see the Peabody Essex Museum. That's the one museum that has nothing to do with witches or pirates. Right? It's actually a very prestigious museum. It's got a fantastic collection of objects that the Indians and the Chinese and other Asians had made for export to the Americas and Europe. A lot of Chinese porcelain is there, and you'd be surprised by how the Europeans and Americans got Chinese artists to draw European coats of arms and pictures of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and all these plates. Although in some cases, the pictures don't always look like George Washington. Right. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the famous author, lived in Salem, and he had written that novel, The House of Seven Gables. Well, the real House of Seven Gables is there. And if you've ever read his novel, The Scarlet Letter, the first chapter is called The Custom House. It has nothing to do with the rest of the novel. It's really a lot of sarcasm and insulting of his fellow civil servants who worked in the custom house. And that particular custom house is still in Salem. There it is. There's that gloomy eagle that he describes in the custom house. So there's a lot of other things in Salem to see other than stuff related to witches. And there's a whole history to Salem that's not related to witches. But nonetheless, in the American psyche, Salem will always be America's Gothic theme park. All right. Okay, thank you. All right. Oh yes, questions. All right, if anyone has any questions or anything. Yeah. Oh, Leanna.
If you had to guess between the different possible reasons for the witch hysteria, which 2 or 3 do you think are most likely?
I think the most likely one is it began with the mischief of the girls, but then became a way to settle political scores, because there was a lot of rivalry between feuding families and political figures and clergy within the village. So I think that's the most likely explanation. Okay, all right. So many hands at the same time. I'll take you in the back there by the portrait. Yeah.
Nathaniel Hawthorne, do you ever consider he might be related to the judge, John Hawthorne?
I think he might have been related. The Judge Hathorne spelled his name without the W in the middle, but Nathaniel Hawthorne was originally spelled his name like that, but then he added the W. So I'm not sure, but I think they were related or to each other. Yeah. There's another. Oh yeah, there.
Were there any characteristics about the women who were identified as witches that made them more vulnerable to be identified that way, or were they just wrong place, wrong time?
Well, the first few were definitely what you call the underclass in society, a beggar, a woman that no one got along with, who hadn't gone to church, and a slave. But afterwards, more respectable people, like what we term middle class or farmers from the middle class got accused and were among the executed. And also remember, there was one clergyman who got executed too. So you're right, it did begin with the vulnerable being accused, but later on other people got accused too. Oh, yeah.
I was just curious to know, how did you yourself get interested in researching and going to Salem?
Oh, okay, well, it's a misspent youth reading Mysterious House of Secrets comic books when I was a kid. Followed by, I guess, watching Bewitched at 4 o'clock right after Batman after school. Right? And those of you who know me know I like horror movies, so I like researching the historical basis of some horror movies. But conveniently, one year, the World Science Fiction Convention was held in Boston, Massachusetts, so I thought this would be a great opportunity to do a diversion over to Salem for 3 days. So, yeah, that's how I got into it. All right.
You mentioned there were witch hunts in England.
Yes.
Were there similarities between what happened in Salem and the witch hunts that went on in England?
Well, the similarities were, well, first, the execution method was the same, hanging. And contrary to what we see in the movies, burning at the stake was not something the English typically did. That was something that continental Europeans did. So Germany, France, that area, they burned people at the stake. The other similarity would have been the way the trials were conducted. No right to representation by a lawyer, the judge and jury often being the same people, and the use of spectral evidence occurred on both sides of the Atlantic as well. Okay.
They're getting back close to that with the Kavanaugh affair, I don't know.
With which affair?
The Kavanaugh affair.
Kavanaugh affair. Oh, okay. Yes. Well, that's modern American history. Well, fortunately, during that, no one's been hanged so far for that, but we'll see. Yeah. Well, that's interesting because that's actually about a judge, right? So, yeah. All right, Eric.
Derwin, the witch trials happened in the late 17th century, but weren't there spades of witch hunting in the late medieval period?
Oh, yeah, there was some, right? There was some witch hunting in the late medieval period, but it would really begin to take off around the 1600s, after or during the wars of religion following the Reformation. That's when witch hunting really became widespread in Europe, right? Because it was part of the society at the time. People were desperately looking for enemies everywhere during the wars of religion. Now, there had been the occasional witch hunt, but it didn't really become a major issue until after the Protestant Reformation. Okay, Tony?
Has anyone suggested that some of these people might have been suffering from epilepsy?
No, that's interesting because especially when the girls start rolling around the floor and so on. Yeah, that's all sorts of theories. I've heard that one too. Yeah, that's possible. Tony.
What's the association between broomsticks and witches?
Oh, okay. Are there any children in the audience? Okay, you know what I'm talking about, Leanna, right? Okay, okay, good. No children. Everyone here is over 18. Okay, good. The association is that a lot of the women who are accused of witchcraft through the centuries tend to be women who knew how to make, folk medicine potions and so on, right? All right. What's that?
Brooms that were for witches?
What's that? Were there special brooms for witches? What's that? Special? I think they just used any old broom that. Yeah. Okay, but right. I know in the Harry Potter movies it gets certain manufacturers of broomsticks and certain models of them, like Chryslers. But anyway, yeah. Okay, any other questions? Okay, one more question.
That's gonna be as interesting as the last one. Well, I was surprised to hear you talk about witches associated with dogs. I always associate them with cats.
They could be associated with any animal.
Oh, any animal?
Yeah. Dogs, cats, any convenient animal that happens to be in town during these witch hunts could get accused of being a familiar. So,
What about the hat? What's the significance of a pointed hat?
the pointed hat. You know what? I don't really know about that, other than the people of that time tend to wear these conical hats anyway.
Thank you very much, Derwin, for a very informative and very interesting presentation.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.